Should you get into architecture? It's something that people ask me about a good bit, and I certainly have thoughts on it because when I started in architecture school back in the late 90s for my undergraduate, if I looked ahead, 25 years now, it wouldn't have been the career path that I ever could have predicted. And that to me is a good thing because what I've been able to do is have a lot of experience and exposure to different sides of the industry. So for instance, my very first job at the end of college and then right after college was designing climbing walls. And it was for a design build company. And so we had people who worked in the shop, which was attached to the office. I was making not only designs, but shop drawings for the people who were building the actual climbing walls in the shop right next door. And from the very beginning, that gave me a very, direct connection with the people actually building things and understanding their input, their skills, what they could do, how we could empower them to do their job better, their feedback on the final designs once they were built, all that different stuff. A lot of those people are actually still some of my closest friends today. And after that, I ended up going back to graduate school. Or one of the biggest surprises for me was that people actually didn't really always care about making buildings. A lot of people liked to draw buildings. A lot of people like to think about architecture or write about architecture or research architecture. And all of that has a perfect place as well. But my interest was always in building buildings. And so my career is always sort of focused on that. And so pretty quickly after working in a sort of boutique firm for a year, I got back into doing design build prefabricated housing and eventually leading development for a climbing gym company doing projects across the country I did that for almost a decade until I've now been doing my own practice for a bit over 2 years. And so that means I've managed construction, I have hired contractors, I've fired contractors, I've hired and managed architects. The whole sort of gamut of going from an idea with an owner through opening a facility and being in charge of managing that whole process. And so all that's just to say that I do feel like I can give a pretty good assessment of the industry and why you may or may not want to get into it. So here it is. Most people get into architecture, or maybe just say the built environment, making buildings, for the right reasons. It's because they like it for some reason. Maybe they like working with their hands, maybe they like designing buildings. Whatever it is, they probably got into it for good reasons. What happens though is a lot of people get chewed up and spat out because architects are notoriously not paid well, which there's another video on my channel about that I can link to below. But in this case, the pay isn't very good, especially for the amount of education and the pain in the ass the licensing is. You would be comparing yourself with the highest professions, doctors, lawyers, whatever, although our profession works in a sort of like back alley way compared to them, who are charging much more reasonable fees for the problems they're solving. For some reason, architects haven't realized that clients actually are willing to pay for valuable services, or not forget services, valuable support to solve problems. That's what we should be charging for. And so that's why my advice to people is always that you have to make it your own. So the answer to if you should get into architecture has a lot of different sort of things that can spin off of that, because you don't have to be a licensed architect to be involved in architecture. A lot of the famous architects you probably have heard of are not licensed. A lot of people, even that are running famous graduate programs, are not licensed. A lot of people around are not licensed, even though they use the word architect, which, by the way, it's the same as saying you're a doctor if you're not. This is something that, again, our industry isn't helping with when they add designations like AIA-S, which means nothing but confuses my clients tremendously. So again, a different conversation. There are opportunities to be involved in architecture and the built environment, constructing the built environment in a lot of ways. My title for almost a decade was development something or other, and that's because I sort of oversaw the whole process. Architects, engineers, contractors, lawyers, permitting, blah, 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 the whole deal. And there are people at each of those positions, each of those offices, each of those companies that are doing very different things. So for instance, if you're the kind of person who likes being on site, that is a good thing to realize because architecture offices need that, contractors need that. It's a very important thing, and not everybody can do it when you have to discuss issues, solve problems on the fly, talk to subcontractors, talk to engineers, talk to other architects, talk to the owner, and boil down what they need. There's so many different people. Engineers are very different than the sort of visionary entrepreneurs I typically work with, are very different than most architects, are very different than most contractors, are very different than most attorneys. So I think my strength as a developer is that I've been able to, or I try really hard to be very strategic and smart and sort of empathetic with the way I communicate with each of these people, realizing that they're very different types of people in very different types of offices. And so all that's just to mean that you could be one of those different people. You don't need to manage the whole thing. If you like to draw and sit in an office and sort of just do that well, being an architect in someone's firm or being a designer may be a good thing for you. But if you like being on site, being that type of architect who's actually really doing more shop drawings, communicating directly with contractors, really like solving like real-time building problems, that's a very specific way to practice as well. And conversely, one of my favorite ways to do project delivery is design build. And that requires a contractor who isn't just looking for the next change order they can hit the client with. It requires someone who is able to really sort of see the process like an architect. They need to be an architect in some cases. But my point is that the sort of models even within the industry are always evolving. There's a lot of different types of ways of doing it. And so the answer is, if it's an industry that you are interested in being a part of, meaning design and building the built environment, or even researching, there's always a way for you to get involved. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to go to architecture school. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to be licensed. Very few people are. I am licensed. I rarely put my stamp on drawings because I'm generally working in all sorts of places around the country where it would be foolish and foolhardy of me and kind of blind of me to assume I know what's going on in Spokane, in Chicago, and Phoenix, or Maine, or whatever. The idea that I can communicate with all of those local municipalities is a really bad idea. And so sort of knowing your strengths, knowing your limits, being strategic about how you sort of put teams together and where you fit in on a team, these are all different things to think about as you're thinking about a career in architecture, or again, to expand it a little bit, the built environment. Because I can tell you from experience, if you're a smart person who especially is good at sort of looking at different aspects, being able to take information from an architect, an engineer, a contractor, and being able to sort of put it together and let it sort of all boil and simmer like some sort of crazy paella or whatever. If you're that kind of person, we need you. Like, being a good person at that, I think there's always going to be room for that. Whether you're working for a contractor, whether you're working at an architecture office, or like me, whether you're working directly with business owners. Because a lot of the people I work with actually are in a position where something doesn't feel right. Maybe they've been told to stop, maybe the project doesn't look quite right, whatever it is, there's often a need for someone to be able to come in and sort of audit the situation, sort things, synthesize things, and this is how I talk about it: sorting, synthesizing, and then figuring out the true intent, figuring out the ingredients, and building the team to execute. It doesn't need to be that complicated, it doesn't need to be that painful, but I think when people's egos get involved, my feeling is, and this is I think why I can be good at being that sort of development person, is all I want is for the best answer to be reached. I don't care if I come up with it, if the engineer does, if the most junior intern does. Hopefully they're being paid. Different conversation. Again, I'll link to that in the notes. But the point is that there are opportunities. If you're interested in the built environment, I would just say, don't listen to people only that have said, don't do it. Any profession where people are saying, don't do it. I find that really sad. I find that to be something that's really, unfortunate, because they probably got into it for the right reasons as well. And so I would just say, make it your own, figure out where you want to fit, test different ideas in terms of get different jobs, especially when you're young. Get a job at a contractor, get a job at a small office, get a job at a big office, work for a boutique architecture studio, work for a 50-person, work for a 100-person architecture studio. These places all have a very different flavor in the type of work, the type of people, the type of management, the type of hours, the type of pay. Again, across the board, all different. So if you are interested in getting involved, I say you should do it. Making buildings is one of the best things in life. You get to go inside and experience this thing that you were dreaming up in your head. It's amazing. It's also a lot of work, and it's a lot of money, and a lot is on the line. So it really just does have to do with your own sort of psychological tendencies and preferences and whatnot. But there's a lot of different places you can slot in. So if you're an ambitious person who wants to learn, who's good at sort of communicating and sharing ideas and working in a ego-free way, please, come on in. The water's warm, and making buildings is fantastic. You just have to figure out how you want to do it. Like everything in life, make it your own and figure it out. I'm happy to help. Please reach out. If you like this and if it's helpful, please like and subscribe. I really do appreciate it. Thanks for your time.